And I guess while people are kind of sitting down and milling about, I'll share my two favorite supply chain stories of the last 2 years. And one, of course, our network, Northern Ag Network and Northern News Network Radio, we get a lot of calls about farm and ranch. And I think that was one element that was really highlighted during the pandemic. I had a farmer say to me in tears, when I went into the store and I noticed there was nothing on the shelves, I thought, oh my gosh, man, maybe people will finally understand what we do and why it matters. Another example would be those instances when we saw some of the Hooterite dairies in Montana have to dump loads of milk just flat onto the ground because you know what? You can't just redirect a supply chain overnight for a product that has a shelf life and put those put the milk into jugs or into the cafeterias. So there's so many different areas that supply chain has been affected, and we've certainly seen that across our business. The truth is the supply chain used to be very lean, but the pandemic changed demand patterns, creating issues in manufacturing, warehousing, and at ports. With lockdowns, unprecedented demand exceeded capacity in production and logistics. So with no redundancy and a lack of proper infrastructure, the supply chain broke down. While the pandemic was unpredictable, but potential long-term solutions are surfacing, including more redundancy in the form of extra capacity, dual sourcing and local sourcing options, and decentralized manufacturing and distribution. Of course, any business in this room will tell you that currently labor capacity issues still exist and will continue to heavily affect the supply chain recovery. Key indicators such as cargo shipping costs being down a third in the past month and Chinese port congestion easing have experts hopeful that bottlenecks will begin to continue to clear in 2022. So with that, I'd now like to invite Wyatt Earp, or Bridger Malum, up to the stage. Bridger's the Government Affairs Director at the Montana Chamber, and he will moderate the next panel, Shaking the Crystal Ball on Supply Chain. Wyatt Earp, everyone.
All right, to everyone's chagrin, my name is Bridger. My name's Bridger, and I like to ride bicycles. In fact, I know a lot of people who like to ride bikes. I see Alan Lloyd on the trails occasionally, Glenn Opal's a fellow mountain biker. In fact, bicycling became a top solo activity during COVID. Everyone seems to be riding them. So for me, 2020 was the ideal, perfect time to be in the market for a brand new bike. I had my heart set on one model and had to wait about 6 months before one in my size became available. And Todd's going to love this, right? So I'm sitting mid-2020 in a work meeting, and I get this email alert. Been waiting 6 months for this email alert. This bike this size is available. So I make an excuse to leave the meeting to go back to my computer and place the order to secure my ride. Now, of course, after the meeting, there was only about 20 more minutes. I checked the retailer website again, and that model was completely sold out again on all sizes. The demand was high, I get it. But then I started reading articles about the bike shortage and learned that it had just as much to do with parts supply as it did with everyone wanting to get their hands on one. Thousands of high-end bicycles, according to what I'd read, were 98% complete and would otherwise already be in the hands of consumers were it not for a missing bearing ring for jockey wheels. And we're talking about a part that's this big, okay? On a bicycle, obviously a bit bigger. And these are essential parts for rear derailleurs. And quite literally, this derailed the bike industry that is still a long way from supply recovery. Now, everyone, needless to say, I now treat my bicycles better than I treat my car. So who knows when I'll be able to get another one. But there are many other more meaningful perspectives than my little anecdote here when it comes to supply chain. In fact, we have a few industries represented in our panel today, and I'm thrilled to introduce our folks that are with us. Michael Wilson, he is owner and CEO of Whitewood Transport out of Billings. It's a leading motor carrier in Montana specializing in heavy load transportation of commodities. And many of you will recognize John Bennion. He's in his roles over the years in both the private sector, he's one of my predecessors in this role, and in the public sector. He was Chief Deputy Attorney General for quite some time. And now he joins us in his relatively new capacity as Government Relations Director for the Washington companies. So please help me welcome Michael and John.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Do I need to get closer and closer? How's that?
Nice.
That's really good.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Well, I'll pass it to you. Yeah, we are going right to you, Mike. So let me pass you the proverbial crystal ball at this stage, just to stick with the theme of the panel, right? So we'll hear your insights on supply chain, of course, and its impact on ground transportation. We'll follow that with John's take on what all this means for the various industries in Washington Company's portfolio. And then from there, after we hear prepared remarks from both of these folks, that's when we're going to have an opportunity to do some engagement with Q&A from all of you, as well as just continued discussion that I might have as far as topics and discussions. So the chamber staff will have roaming microphones when we get to that Q&A component, so raise your hand when we're at that stage so that we can get to you quickly and we can all hear your questions. So, Mike, I now present the floor to you. Thanks for your enthusiasm and for being here today.
Hey, you bet. Thank you, Bridger. Appreciate the introduction. And it's great to be up here with John and try and give you guys some good information about what's going on in our supply chain. It ain't pretty, but we'll try and, we're gonna try and figure out what we can do to improve it from the trucking side. I do want to say something about the bike thing, though. I fell in the bike trap as well. It was only like $3,200, but it was an e-bike, and I don't have the energy to do all the pedaling like he does, but it's pretty fun. You want to feel like you're 16 years old again. So I want to talk a little bit first about my company and what we do. And I'm going to show you, So we haul oversized freight, mostly, all over the United States. But we do quite a bit here in Montana. And it's complicated. It takes a tremendous amount of expertise. My guys need to know how to run equipment. They need to be able to load it themselves. They need to understand the permitting process. Mac was talking about how they've made things better for getting our permits and oversized stuff, and he's right. It's much better under this administration, and we really appreciate it. My company moves about 8,000 to 9,000 loads of freight a year all over the U.S. We don't have the ability to move it all on our own, so about half of that goes on our trucks, half goes on other carriers that we contract with. And we have to make sure they have all the compliance and all the things that the state of Montana and the federal government wants us to do. It's very cumbersome, it's very complicated, and most folks don't understand just how tough it can be. But we love it. We've got great operators, and it's certainly a challenge. We have 17 people in our office that work to run just 31 trucks. And our average length of haul, even though we run to Alaska, is only 505 miles. So you can understand there's a good portion of the freight that we move serves the forest industry, ag, mining, construction, and energy, including wind. We do a lot of wind transport for cranes, for the erection and for the maintenance. We really don't get involved in the blades that, like Mac was talking about. He didn't tell you this, but those things are 120 feet long. And the typical semi that you see going down the road is 65 to 70 feet long. So that's the big difference, and that's what makes it complicated, getting those things around corners and get them to where they need to go. So, a couple of things about the trucking industry in itself. We're 5% of the GDP. We're huge. We employ like 7.6 million people. There's 3.5 million trucks out there moving your Wheaties. We are huge in terms of what's going on in our country's economy. And it's, like I said, it's complicated. We are highly regulated and constantly under pressure, and I'm going to get to some of that in a few minutes, and that's why we're having a problem getting new drivers and retaining drivers so that we can take care of the freight that needs to be moved out there. One more, let's see, I can't really see that. So this is another slide of what we do, this oversized stuff. I think this piece came out of Wyoming and actually went to a mine in Montana. So that was like 22 feet wide. I told you that we do about 8,000 loads a year. I want to just kind of touch on what happened to us when we hit the pandemic. I took my general manager to lunch and I said, what are we going to do if this thing's for real? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, we better make some plans. So we did. And they were from, okay, we're not going to let anybody in the building. Everybody has to wear a mask. You've got to hand sanitize. You've got to do all these things. What happens if we have to start working remotely? Well, we got our IT guy in there, and he says, oh, God, we've got to have all these remote licenses, and we got to have all this. We got to have all that. We're getting laptops and scanners and all these different things. We made this big investment, and then we actually sent people home and had them test it. We don't know if we're going to need this or not, but let's see what happens. Within 2 months, out of the 17, 18 people, I only had 2 in the office. Everybody else was working from home. Our trucks never stopped. You want to talk about isolation, 6-foot distancing, not touching anything, not being around anybody. Trucking industry's doing it. But now it's all catching up to us, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. So, we did well. We actually, in terms of load count, tonnage, all of that, we were pretty consistent, a little less than 19. But the greatest thing was there were hardly any cars out on the highways because everybody was staying home. It was awesome. Our guys could go. You get in the big cities, it was awesome. But we knew that was temporary, and we wanted it to be temporary. So, supply chain. It's very complex. It's very fragile. It's made up of multiple links for a reason. And I don't know that everybody always appreciates that, but it's very, very complicated. And the biggest problem we have is our dependence on foreign trade. I think that our numbers are 2.4 trillion that we imported in 20. 19 and 20, pretty consistent. We exported about 1.46 trillion. Big gap. So our dependence on all of that stuff that you're buying in Walmart or at the hardware store, when their manufacturing and factory output shut down, just as ours did in 2020, the whole world shut down. And when it did, everybody stopped obviously making things, but they were still consuming things. And when 2021 hit, we were out of product. We depleted our inventories in this country. We depleted our inventories globally. And that's why there's such a scramble. And we started putting all this pressure on workers to get back to work and get all this stuff done. And I don't care what business you're in, we put a lot of pressure on folks. And you know what? Their attitudes changed. Their desire to work changed. You got to remember, and I see a lot of gray out here, the baby boomers are outnumbered by the millennials. They think differently than we do. They don't want to do things the way we did. They don't have the same work ethic. But if we can figure out how to work with them and how to train them and how to get that next level of workforce out there, we're going to be okay. So, it all comes down to pent-up demand. And I want to go back to this other slide. So that factory output, this is from Bob Costello at the American Trucking Association. Bob's the chief economist at the ATA, and I'm on that board. So I borrowed some of these slides from him so I could share them with you guys today. But it shows you what happened in 2020. And we weren't making anything. But 2021, when it came back, which is where we're at now, and you can see the trend is going upward, it's a big difference. And that's really why we have such a capacity problem, because we're not able to haul the freight that's out there, whether you're rail or truck. This is retail sales today. And it includes $204 billion in online sales. People have money, they're buying stuff, they're ordering stuff online, and it's all got to be moved. It's all got to be trucked at some point. You might put it on the railhead, but you still got to get it from manufacturing or the warehouse there. And certainly the cargo. So I was talking about imports a little bit. I apologize for skipping around here. But in 2019, you might have 1 or 2 cargo ships offshore. Today, there's 70 to 90. There's so many and there's so much congestion, they're pushing the Chinese ships 150 miles out from the ports. 150 miles. They're sitting out there polluting the air, dragging their anchors, and because there's no place to put the freight. We do not have the infrastructure in our ports or the warehousing to take care of all of this demand. Now, I think we're going to be okay. It's going to come around. But for right now, we got a big battle on our hands. And in the short term, it's not going to change much. When we do get all this resolved, we still have to move the freight on trucks. And that's a problem because of our drivers. The average age of a truck driver today is 46 years. The average age of the workforce in this country, anybody want to guess? I didn't think so. It's 42. So we got a problem there. Our workforce is aging. We need to find ways to get these guys into the industry, and we got to give them reasons to do it. We got to treat them right. I talked to one of my drivers the other day, and he says, "Mike, there's a problem. I can't get any food. These truck stops out here, their restaurants are closed. Now they have delis. And you can eat at a deli once or maybe twice, but I'm not eating it all day, every day." It's a problem. We have something called the Eld Mandate. It's electronic logging. And basically, Big Brother is sitting in your truck with you. He knows within 25 feet any time of the day where you're at. When you started your truck, when you moved your truck, when you didn't move your truck. It's a problem. Do any of you want a camera looking right at you when you're sitting at your desk all day? Because that's what it is in the trucking industry. All of these ELDs, they look out, and some of them, if you turn it on, look back in. And they don't want to do it. Because of the new hours of service rules, which in a 14-hour day, 70-hour week, you can drive 10 hours a day, and you think that sounds like a lot until you start, well, you got to have this inspection at this period, and you got to do this, and you got to do that. It's hard to get down the road. What it comes down to is these guys are working by the second. Not by the day, not by the hour, not by the mile, by the second. And because of our speed limits and some of the rules that their companies have, they have governors on the trucks, he's whistling down the road at 65 miles an hour. And a guy comes up behind him at 66. And he's got to get down the road. And here comes me and John, we're heading to a football game, and we're going 85. Does the guy behind 65 care? No. He will pass him on the Columbus Hill and back up all this traffic. That's a problem. It's a safety issue. We talk about all these new folks coming from out of state. They think the shoulder is another lane. It's not good. So we got to get some of our regulations straightened out and take the pressure off these guys, or the National Guard's going to be delivering your freight. And I'm not kidding you, because the demand is greater than what we can fulfill as an industry. So, did I have another slide? I think this is housing starts, and sorry, Bridger, I'm not following my slides like I'm supposed to, but and this is just another push on the demand for our services and what's happened. We're rolling along, and I think somebody on the panel earlier talked about this, that there's a lot of building going on, and we know a lot of folks are coming into our state, but this is national information here. So just wanted to share that with you. I want to just tell you a couple things about what we're doing. We have something called the Drive Safe Act that's allowing us to bring drivers in and that are not 21, because I know you guys don't know this rule, but I'm going to share it with you. If you're 18 years old and you work on the farm or ranch in Billings, Montana, or anywhere in the state of Montana for that matter, and your dad wants you to drive the grain truck or whatever, you can run around Montana all you want. It's a big state. It's okay. But you cannot go across the state line. You have to be 21 years old. So, can we keep those guys in the industry? Nope. We lose them. We lose them to trade schools. If they want to be a blue-collar guy, we're going to lose them to trade school. We're going to lose them to military. And by the time they're in the military and they get back out, we can't get them. So there's a push by the Biden administration to change that. I don't know how successful they're going to be, but we're hoping that they can get something done to help us with that problem. And and we'll see. But we have to treat our guys better. Go back to the interstate deal. When that guy pulls out in front of the other guy and you're running up on him and you're mad because he did it, don't give him a hand signal. He's trying to make a living, and he's doing it under the rules that have been imposed upon him by the federal government. So give him a break. The other problems that we have is when we deliver at these places today, and they all have different COVID rules, you can't use our bathroom, you can't come in the building, and you can't use our deli. There's a Taco John's down the street. Oh, but that's just a drive-through because they don't have their lobby open, and they don't take walk-ups. These are the things that these guys are running into. Not good. Am I all right?
Yeah, a few more minutes and we'll
Okay.
pass it to John.
All right. I'll just tell you a couple other things. We have new Cdl Testing Regulations that I think are good. That's going to help make things consistent across the board. We have a lot of drug and alcohol testing that's critical, and we're all for that. But it knocked 70,000 people out of the qualified arena in the last 2 years. That's not a bad thing, depending on what it is. We just legalized marijuana in the state of Montana, in South Dakota, and New Jersey. In fact, almost every state has something leaning that way. That's going to make it tough because we have to drug and alcohol test all of our drivers. And if you have any trace of marijuana, you cannot drive. So I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, just saying it's just another barrier to getting these guys in. And I'm just going to say one more thing, and I talked to Todd about this a little bit this morning. We have an issue at the Canadian border effective on Saturday. If you are not vaccinated, you cannot go into that country. And on the 22nd, it goes the other way. I don't know if you know much about Canada, but they don't produce a whole bunch of stuff. They consume a lot of stuff. And it's going to hurt my business and a lot of others. We go to Alaska 9-10 times a year, just one of my trucks. And how are we going to do an in-transit move through Alberta and the other provinces if they're not vaccinated? And I'm sorry, folks, but a lot of these guys are not vaccinated, and they're not going to do it. So if you have 3.5 million trucks with drivers, and we estimate losing 30% of those guys because of the possible problem that we have with the mandate here in the U.S., on top of that one, 1,000 drivers. I mean, it's 100,000, million. It's a lot. So I mean, it's all scaled. And so that's kind of where we're at today. There's a huge problem with capacity and drivers and retention, and we're trying to do the best we can. I hope I painted a picture for you. Didn't make it too confusing, but we're doing the best we can. Scott.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, go for it, John.
All right.
It's all you.
So I did not come with a PowerPoint, and it's not because I'm unprepared. I have kind of this unhealthy fear of PowerPoints after there was a state senator from Butte that actually introduced a bill to tax PowerPoints, and ever since then I'm afraid he's going to show up and I might get taxed. And so, no, it's great to be here. It's great to be a part of this panel. I have been with the Washington companies now for a year, and it's been a great learning experience. I have a great set of team members that I work with. I've learned a lot from, and so it's been a great move. As a part of the Washington companies, I wanted to talk about a couple companies in particular that relate to the supply chain. One of them is Montana Rail Link, and as you've probably read in the news, there have been some developments on Montana Rail Link, and some of those relate to the supply chain. So just a little bit about MRL as a business. It was started in 1987 by entrepreneur Dennis Washington. At the time, Burlington Northern felt like the line wasn't as crucial, just given where the industry was at that point in time. And so Mr. Washington took a risk and said, let's start a railroad, and had been operating that line. It's about a 900-mile stretch of line just east of Billings and all the way to Sandpoint, Idaho. So what a lot of folks don't know is that Montana Rail Link does not own that main line. We lease it from BNSF. And so the news this week announced the conclusion of that lease, a conversation that was going to have to happen at some point, and it just moved up a little bit. What's important to note is that 90% of the freight that ran across Montana Rail Link's line was BNSF freight anyway. So this is a move where BNSF ultimately will operate the southern line, and what we're really excited about is they want to incorporate all of Montana Rail Link's employees with the same pay, where they work now, those kinds of things, which is a good move, I think, for BNSF. So all of that requires the necessary approvals, which we hope will happen sometime before the end of this year. We also operate a short line railroad in Canada. It's about a 125-mile stretch. It's called the SRY Rail Link, also Southern Railway, and it interchanges with about 4 Class 1 Canadian railroads. The other set of companies I wanted to talk about is C-SPAN, and that's not the C-SPAN channel that I nerded out as a kid on. That's SEASPAN. And it's an association of Canadian companies primarily involved in coastal marine transportation, ship docking, ship repair, shipbuilding services in Western North America. And the shipyards are an important resource for the region's marine industry. The company's operations consist of 3 shipyards in the British Columbia area. One interesting tidbit is Vancouver, British Columbia. It's Canada's 3rd largest city, its largest and busiest port, and North America's 3rd largest trade hub. So we're here to talk about the supply chain. If social distancing was the buzzword of 2020, supply chain certainly would have been one of the buzzwords of 2021. And folks in the business industry may have used that term before, but now everybody's talking about it. And there's a lot of news. And we started to hear about it more in earnest probably last summer, and especially in the fall, heading into Christmas season. Go do your Christmas shopping now. You won't get your stuff. Quick, run, all of that stuff. So, and I'm willing to bet that most of us have had some kind of, just in our personal life, some supply chain related issue, whether it's you're at the grocery store and you can't find what you want, you've been trying to buy a car, you've been trying to get something serviced, all that kind of stuff has probably impacted your family. But when I was researching for this panel, I found one very disturbing story. in my research that the latest supply chain snafu is a shortage of McDonald's French fries in Japan. And so now we know this is getting real. And it's impacting French fries, it's impacting hash browns. And it's a joke, but really this is to highlight something which is I think we're thinking in terms of supply chain, how it affects us. This is global. This is affecting everybody globally. And part of what I talk about today talks about some of those global things, why this is happening, but then I'm also going to focus on some of those more regional and local things that keep us from getting caught up on some of these supply chain issues. So let's talk just a little bit about pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, the economy was going fairly well, stock market going well. There had been 23 straight quarters of economic growth and only 2 economic quarterly retractions since the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. Unemployment had gone from around 10% in 2010 to an average of below 4% just before the pandemic. And the poverty rate was actually at the lowest historic rate it had ever been at. So what changed? Well, we all know what changed. It was COVID, and that was the catalyst. It was an immediate and wholly unexpected worldwide disruption in work, in manufacturing, in transportation. It was the sharpest economic downturn in a quarter that we had ever seen, and it made a lot of the other downturns on certain graphs look small in comparison. Although certain essential workers stayed on the job, many were sent home, borders were closed, and many unknowns with the economy. So when lockdown first started in March and April of 2020, transportation restrictions came into place. This hit global trade drastically, in particular the exports from Europe and the United States. It fell by 25%. So, however, in China, this was different. Exports surpassed imports. So with China's exports to the United States and to Europe outperforming its imports to those countries, there was a sudden and unexpected shift in the direction of trade. Now, there was a bounce back. As Mike pointed out, consumers started spending pretty quickly again. They had money in their pockets. By the time certain work from home adjustments were made, unemployment benefits were defined, stimulus dollars were pumped into the economy, consumers were spending again. And in fact, consumer spending right now is 15% above pre-pandemic levels. And I think some of Mike's graphs show that. So, consumers spending a lot online. They weren't traveling as much, certainly not internationally, like going across the border to Canada, Mexico, Europe. They're staying at home, they're ordering stuff online, they're catching up on episodes of Yellowstone, all of that kind of important stuff. So the GDP, stock market, unemployment rates, and everything are better than pre-pandemic levels. Commodity prices are up. Coal has rebounded some, but there is still quite a bit of uncertainty and cautious attitudes when it comes to the economy. Consumers definitely have noticed inflation. We've found that inflation rates are at a 40-year high as they were in 1982. Businesses can't find workers can't find housing. In shipping, there has been a container shortage. With examples of container prices being triple or quadruple over what they were pre-pandemic. Containers on ships can be unloaded fast enough. They can't be unloaded fast enough to return to Asia. And that, of course, all this can impact our exports to Asia and what we can get over in that direction. So we know that COVID was the catalyst that started all this, but COVID continues to be a continual disruption in the supply chain. The Delta variant last summer and in the fall was a disruption, especially in the workforce. Currently, right now, what we're seeing with Omicron, there's school closures. There's more testing available, it seems like, and so I think people are more aware when they test positive, even if they're asymptomatic. What does that mean? That means people are using sick days like they haven't before. I mean, it used to be the cool thing to just power through when you have the flu and, man, I'm just going to show up to work and aren't I great? And now, the 21st century thing is no, don't come and don't infect all of your coworkers, please, And so that continues to be a disruption. But COVID alone is not what's keeping us from catching up. I can't remember who said this, but COVID in many ways poured gas on certain things that were kind of happening anyway or going to imminently happen as a part of our society. So we know that online shopping has gone way up. Contactless options and self-service mobile options. Has anyone ordered groceries off an app and had them in your trunk now for the first time in this last year? I did that. If you're using a mobile app now for like restaurants, getting delivery from entities that you never expected before, all that stuff probably would have happened anyway, but COVID just made them happen. But there were also things that we kind of knew were on the horizon, and either we were ill prepared for them or we didn't really see them happening in conjunction with a worldwide pandemic. One of them was the need for infrastructure. We've been talking about infrastructure in this country, upgrading stuff for at least a decade, if not 2 decades or longer. And Congress finally made some significant investments happen. That is going to take many, many years to play out and see how that's going to work. So we know that infrastructure deals with upgrading our roads, upgrading bridges, all that's very important. One thing that you may not hear as much about because we're in Montana is our ports and the need to do stuff there. And so I know the White House announced about $17 billion in investments for our ports, which are going to be very important. Prior to the pandemic, about 2 to 3% of the world's freight was on a container ship. And now my friends at C-SPAN tell me it's somewhere above 10%. And so when it comes to upgrading our port system, both in the United States and Canada, those are incredible and needed investments. Workforce, of course, at this meeting, that's probably the thing that you're going to talk about most as a business issue. And as a Generation Xer, I know Mike talked about the boomers and the millennials. I'm part of that cool in-between generation that everybody forgets about. We're super cynical and grungy. We're too cool for school. I don't know. But I was always told growing up, just you wait till the baby boomers retire. Hold on to your hats. Well, some of that was happening prior to COVID, and I think what's happening now is there are people that maybe thought they would be in the workforce in another couple years, and they're saying, I think I'm out, checking out. So that's one part of the workforce equation. There's a lot of households that have figured out either they can make it work with one income and somebody stays at home, or they have no other choice. And just my anecdotal observation during question and answer, I'd be interested if anybody would back this up. I've just noticed fewer young people in the workforce in certain service industry jobs that used to be occupied by young people in high school. You just don't see that quite as much. I think the COVID situation has permanently altered people's expectations of how, when, and where they work. Anything that could have been made remote was made remote in 2020 or 2021, at least on a temporary basis. And companies that want to recruit or retain employees may find that while salaries have to be a big part of the discussion because of inflation and all of that and competition, also where people work. Are they able to work from home? And those kinds of considerations are discussions that weren't happening 2 years ago. So COVID has also irreparably potentially damaged one thing that we may not have described as infrastructure a couple years ago, but childcare. The ability for childcare, whether it's before kids are able to go to school or while kids are in school and school is canceled. Those are big considerations for parents and businesses heading into the next few years. And in Montana, we also know that we have a housing crisis nearly everywhere when you're looking for workforce housing. And we've seen an influx of new people coming into Montana. We've all seen it. We've felt it. There's real estate prices going up. There's out-of-state license plates coming in. Are they coming here because they watched a lot of Yellowstone? I don't know. But whether they're in Montana to work here, or if they're working remotely, or if they're retired, I think we're going to see a lot more statistics that hopefully show who are these folks coming in and what is it that they want to do here. In short, the workforce looks a lot different than it did in early 2020. And so some of this we knew was going to come, and some of it was a little bit unexpected. Climate, I want to talk about climate for a minute. We know that we've seen changes ahead of 2020, and in 2021 we saw some significant impacts from climate and natural disasters. In Montana we saw record droughts, we saw forest fires. In British Columbia, climate and natural disasters had a very noticeable impact on supply chains. So those regional and local natural disasters were significant. In June of last year, British Columbia recorded its highest temperature ever at 121 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know about you, but that's sometimes hard to find people that want to work outside in those conditions. In November, British Columbia saw record precipitation brought up by something I didn't know what it was until 2021, atmospheric rivers that produced landslides, washed out rail lines, and took out bridges, and it damaged a lot of homes. This fall, 500 of our trains during a 2-week period were disrupted because of a lot of these things. So that might sound small, but again, every little thing that happens at a global, regional, or even a local level is harder and harder for us to keep catching up on the supply chain issue. There's also geopolitical, I know this is a lot of doom and gloom. There's a lot of geopolitical conflicts that we keep hearing about in the news, China rattling its saber at Taiwan, and Russia building up troops across Ukraine and Iran and things like that. Any one of those things could potentially have an impact on global markets and certainly on supply chain, especially if we're talking about China. So what are companies doing in response? Well, at least with the workforce, employees have a lot more bargaining power when it comes to schedules, retaining employees, where they work, how many hours they work, coming up with things that look very much more unique to specific employees, especially if you really need those employees. Training the workforce of tomorrow is something, I know it's been important, but as we see more and more people leave the workforce and retire, making sure that we have a skilled workforce, younger folks that are filling in those jobs where older people are retiring is incredibly important. For the ports, companies have had everything that used to have everything brought to one port are diversifying. I talked to some folks that said, well, a lot of West Coast traffic gets diverted through the Panama Canal and is now on the East Coast. I don't know if that's going to be an overall lasting trend, or if when things kind of correct themselves, if we'll see companies choose and go back to their normal habits. Businesses are ordering more inventory. I think, as Mike pointed out, that just to stay ahead. They know the demand is going to be there. They're afraid of not being able to meet customer demand. What that creates is a problem with where do you put all this stuff? And there's cost involved there. And then, of course, streamlining transportation systems, whether it's trucking, rail, air, all of that's being looked at. When it comes to infrastructure investments, I've talked to many business folks, both in large and small businesses, that are very interested in being engaged with our elected officials. and decision makers about how those infrastructure dollars are spent, and making sure that they're spent wisely and in ways that can have a long-term positive impact on the supply chain. There are businesses with production overseas looking to bring things to North America, bring things to Montana. Savvy businessmen and women see this as potential opportunities. It's kind of the turning lemons into lemonade. It's an economic security issue. It's a national security issue. But it's also an opportunity to see how we can grow things and invest right here in Montana. So I would be happy to either answer any of your kinds of questions or hear any kind of comments that you have. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, John. So we do have about 10 minutes for Q&A discussion to roll through here. I think we got some staff with microphones running around, and some folks have got their hands raised. As we get the first questioner prepared, I'll start with one for both of you. And I was just curious as I was thinking about this panel a bit more, and when it comes to shared challenges, COVID obviously being one of them for everybody, no matter what your background is. I'm curious to hear from each of you, Mike and John, whether your businesses are cooperating with competitors on this issue as a shared challenge. And if you are, how are you able to accomplish that without unintentionally giving away any strategic advantages you might already have over them in a pre-pandemic or post-pandemic scenario? Mike, let's start with you on
Well, we're pretty
working with
top
competition.
secret. We don't share anything. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, a couple things. We are a member of the Motor Carriers of Montana. Dwayne Williams is here today, and we have 300 members in the state of Montana, and we work collectively to come up with better ideas to solve these problems. And also, I'm a member of the American Trucking Association, which is a federation of all the state trucking associations. And I'm on their board, and we work a lot on these things, and we have folks right on Capitol Hill that represent us, and we have to work together without sharing too much, obviously, but it's a big problem. One of the stats that I didn't share with you is we are currently at 80,000 drivers short, and in 8 years it'll be 160,000, and it's a problem. So training, making life better for folks, that's what we do in our industry. Go ahead, John.
Right.
Sure. I think there is a lot of informal cooperation when you're looking at company to company, certainly within our own companies, but industry to industry. The Washington Companies is involved not just in shipping, rail, mining, environmental remediation, vendors of construction equipment, all those kinds of things, a variety of different industries. And so whether it's through associations like the Chamber, industry associations, or others, making sure that we partner and work through this together, I think is important.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe that was a little bit more of a shameless plug than I thought it would be going into the question. Join the Chamber, we'll help you out. All right, we got a question in the back.
Thank you. Your discussion, both of you, about the problems with the supply chain, especially having to do with imports, the 90 ships, treading water out there. Have either of you seen any impact domestically of increased manufacturing here, people taking advantage of the situation to avoid that international supply chain dilemma?
Do we take that?
Sure.
Well, that's why we're here. We want to talk to you folks about minimizing our reliance on international trade. We want to make stuff here. We found out, and I think John even mentioned this, we found out, it shed the light on it really quick how big our problem was when we rely on others. And if we can get more manufacturing done here, and right here in the state of Montana, we have opportunities. Yeah, we got to get raw materials in here and things like that. But you guys are all the smart folks. You figure it out. We got to be able to do that here and employ folks and keep our kids here, keep our educated kids here, and start producing so we're not relying on Asia or Russia and some of these other places. So that's what I would say about that, Tony.
I think I've definitely heard a lot about that. It's yet to see whether that will come about or if things correct too fast, and then we're like, oh, well, that's in the rearview mirror. Now let's just go back to what we were doing 2 years ago. I think when COVID hit and we were realizing how much of protective equipment, how much of our medicine, and then things like more on the supply chain front from this last year about electronics and chips and rare earth minerals and things like that. It's given people, especially savvy people that are entrepreneurs, a new perspective on this of how much more of that can we do here? And even if it costs a little bit more, there is a value in that, in having that economic and national security component of it. Because like I said, again, not to be too doom and gloom, is it just takes one little thing in the geopolitical arena or wherever just to really disrupt things in an even bigger way, where from a strategic standpoint, it's hard to get the things that we need because we might be in a conflict with somebody or there might be tension. And so I think it's a hugely important conversation to have here going forward, regardless of how much we quickly we recover from the supply chain.
Can I add just one piece to that?
Yeah, go for it,
So
Mike.
semiconductors, microchips. There's a company in Taiwan, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They produce 75% of all the semiconductors used globally. 75%. So when we shut our auto plants down here, they lost a great big customer. So what did they do? They shifted gears and they started making different semiconductors for different businesses abroad. So when we fired ours back up again, we couldn't get those. It takes 8 months for them to reconfigure, build, get them tested in Malaysia, send them over here so Ford can put them in the new pickups. That's why there's thousands of vehicles sitting out there that can't be delivered. Now, I think we're catching up with that, but that's one thing. Intel, I think, does 12%, but they don't have the ability to build the semiconductors that are needed in a vehicle. I think there's some vehicles out there today that need 105 different semiconductors in one car pickup. So that's something, Tony, that was a great question. I mean, that's something that we really need to focus on here. Get geared up, tooled up, so that we can start doing that here in the U.S.
All right, we've got time for maybe one more question if somebody's already got the mic in hand. Somebody have one? Here we go.
Hi, thanks. I think my question is for Mike. I'm Sue Vinton. I represent House District 56 in Lockwood. We have quite a few trucking companies there. You mentioned the lack of drivers, but you also mentioned the increased requirements for a CDL license. I think I heard that you have to take a 4-week class now in order to obtain a CDL. So what are your thoughts on getting more drivers into the pipeline, but also having increased requirements for obtaining that CDL?
So the increased requirements are for the 18-year-old. That's to get him in. The other rules that are coming down, and I think February 9th, that's going to make it consistent for existing CDL holders to renew under the same guidelines and the same reading material and testing and all of that. So, and I agree with that. I don't have an issue with that. We just need to figure out how to get these young kids in. Sue, that's a great question. If it's too onerous, they're not going to do it. They just aren't. And there's apprenticeship that goes along with that. That's several miles and months that they have to go out. And then you got to find somebody that's willing to do it. Who wants that punk kid in their truck with them, And so, I mean, that's really a problem. So running them through these driving schools, stuff like that, costs a lot of money. There's a lot of motor carriers say, hey, we'll pay the tuition, but you're working for us. So, there's some of those things too.
All right, so we are running right on time. So I feel like I had the unenviable task here of seeing what I could do to bring out some of the optimism towards the end of this. And again, there were some great remarks here. Really highlights the challenges that we're facing, and some solutions have been brought forward as well, which is always encouraging. But we heard about workers, infrastructure, foreign trade, regulations, natural disasters even. I mean, the deck seems to be stacked against us, but I think the message I would just leave with the group here, and I think my panelists would agree, is that Montana is resilient. I have faith with the employers I talk to in the position I'm in that they do what they need to do to keep their best workers, because they know that's what keeps them successful, is their talent. And we deliver on our customer service, and we do it in the Montana way. So let's thank Mike and John for taking the time to spend with us today on this important issue. All right, Nancy, you're up.
Thanks, Mike and John. I appreciate it. Maybe to bring us back to the positive light a little bit, and to follow up with what was just said about us Montanans being resilient and jumping back, I think we're really friendly people. And I'll share with you that I was lucky enough to be in Frisco, Texas with 10,000 of my closest friends last weekend. Go Cats. And one of our Uber drivers said to me, she's like, man, I thought us Texans were really friendly, but you Montanans take the cake. And so I think that's true. I think we're all good people. I think all of us on every side of an issue are good people, and we do things the Montana way, which is super important. All right, now that we're done talking about supply chain issues that I know have no doubt have impacted every single one of you, let's turn to another topic that drives the cost of doing business, which is our legal climate. And I personally know how important this is. Predictability in state legal systems has become a very important factor for businesses when they're making investment decisions in Montana. And part of that comes down to timeframes. And what does that look like? State chambers and organizations dedicated to tort reform are responsible and responding by taking leadership roles in the legislature and courts on their legal environments so that they're fair and follow the rule of law. The chamber has led this charge in Montana, passing meaningful tort reform in the legislature and publishing its biennial judicial review of court cases that impact business. So moderating our next panel is David Bell. Am I seeing David? Oh, good. David is the chair of the Montana Justice Coalition and president and CEO of Alps Corporation and Alps Property and Casualty Insurance Company. Please welcome David.
Thank you, Nancy. I know I've seen it all when Wyatt Earp attempts to tease out the optimism from a supply chain panel. That was a super interesting, if not wholly depressing, assessment of our supply chain. I think we're going to have to put some Prozac out next to the pretzels in the back there. But it is a pleasure to be here with you. As Nancy mentioned, in addition to having the pleasure of chairing the Justice Coalition, I also have the honor of leading Alps. And I mention this to you because there are so many great businesses and industries represented in this room, and we at Alps are honored to be among you. We're the largest direct insurer of legal malpractice in the country, insuring more than 20,000 law firms and lawyers in 47 states, all from Missoula, Montana. But with all that coolness, I know many of you have kids. I don't know how many of you have kids who do not think that your business is cool, but I work for insurance for lawyers. And so when Bring Your Parent to Work Day comes up, guess who does not get an invitation? This guy. Why would you invite me when you can have somebody who works on the railroad or hauls a 250-foot long wind turbine up through Alaska? That sounds like a parent-teacher I'd like to go to. But I have a real excitement here to talk today with these two panelists about this topic, which is among the most important to all of us. It affects all of us, no matter what industry you're in, and no matter how much business that you do in Montana. When we were here together last time at Business Days in 2020, I had the privilege of moderating the panel between the then candidates for Attorney General. And I know, like many of you, I am passionate about Montana and a predictable and fair judicial environment. And I'm excited to facilitate this discussion. We'll be treated today with both a national and a state perspective from our panelists. Joining us from the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform is David Meyerson, who works closely with state advocates across the country as Associate Director for Legislative Affairs. We're also excited to have with us, Senator Steve Fitzpatrick of District 10 in Great Falls. Steve was named Montana Chamber's MVP of the 2021 legislative cycle for his leadership role in passing several quality legal reform bills. You know, I have a particular admiration for Senator Fitzpatrick, particularly because these days everything is so tribalized, and not just in politics. And I myself am often guilty of this, but we can often be put into one category or another, one color or another. And Steve's law practice is very diverse, and it gives him the ability to approach even issues like this from a varied perspective. And I find that both informative, at times frustrating, as we've dealt through issues, but really a privilege to have Steve sharing his insights with us today. So we'll start with some prepared remarks from David, and then from there we'll hear from the senator, and I'll try to agitate some discussion, and we'll almost immediately welcome input from the audience. So please, as you listen to these two gentlemen, be thinking about questions you have from them, because that opportunity will come early in this session. Thank you. And David.
Well, thank you very much, David. Great name, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here in Montana. Bridger, Todd, I really appreciate the invitation to come give that national perspective. Senator Fitzpatrick, great to be here with you. I know you're a great champion for the business community, so it's wonderful to share a stage with you. I would like to take a step back, and I know many of you probably are familiar. Never been told I can't be heard, but there we go. I know many of you are familiar with the U.S. Chamber, but I want to take a little step back and take a dive on to the U.S. Chamber and the Institute for Legal Reform. So the U.S. Chamber is the world's largest business organization with a 100-plus year history. Our members range from small businesses and chambers of commerce across the country, such as the Montana Chamber, to leading industry associations and global corporations. My specific department, the Institute for Legal Reform, is a division within the U.S. Chamber that advocates for civil justice reform at the state, federal, and international levels. Our mission is to champion a fair legal system that promotes economic growth and opportunity. We pursue that mission by containing, disrupting, and dismantling the abusive litigation system that is unfortunately somewhat unique to this country. At a tactical level, that means leveraging unbridled advocacy, strategic communications, credible research, and voter education. From an advocacy standpoint, we are active on Capitol Hill, the federal agencies, in states across the country, and countries around the world. And while I could really bore you with the work we're doing to combat class action expansion in the UK or to contain third-party litigation funding in Australia, I suspect you're much more interested in what is going on right here in Big Sky Country. The good news is that in our most recent survey of state litigation climates, Montana finished 7th in the country. This ranking comes as part of ILR's work with the renowned public opinion firm Harris Poll, where senior legal officers and executives at companies worth $100 million or more are surveyed on the quality of states' legal climates. Their perception is critical. In the last survey, 89% of respondents, a record, said a state's legal decisions, a state's legal climate is an important factor in business decisions like where to locate, expand, and do business. While the per household cost of Montana's tort system, $3,195 a year, sounds like a lot, and it is, it's actually $134 less than the national average. However, that number calculates to 2.9% of Montana's GDP, which is slightly higher than the national average of 2.3%. Finishing 7th is not only impressive in its own right, but the 20-point jump from where Montana finished in the previous survey is even more impressive, considering it is the largest improvement of any state. This jump is all the more impressive when you factor in that Montana was rising all the way from 45th just a decade ago. It also places Montana in good company, sitting alongside many of your neighbors, with Wyoming coming in at number 4, Idaho at number 9, North Dakota at number 6, and South Dakota at 10. Among the areas of greatest improvement include the standard of expert evidence, which was a 24-point jump, and the overall treatment of tort and contract litigation, a 26-point gain. There was also a marked improvement in the perception towards damages, proportional discovery, now second best in the country, and jury fairness. At this point, you're probably asking what has contributed to this improvement. In short, it's not just one thing, but a collection of positive changes and strong leadership. First, Attorney General Austin Knudsen has not only been a leader on legal reform issues here in this state, but an example for other attorney generals nationally to follow. By getting rid of his department's use of contingency fee lawyers, he's no longer outsourcing Montana's legal authority, and as a result, lowering overall legal costs. In the category of not resting on one's laurels, though, this progress could benefit by being put into statute. By joining the 16 other states that have passed transparency in private contracting laws, known as TPAC, Montana could ensure these reforms stand the test of time. TPAC statutes that encourage transparency are needed now more than ever, with trial lawyers pitching all kinds of claims to states and municipalities, actions that require a new response and a topic I'll touch on momentarily. Second, the cracking down on forum shopping. The U.S. Supreme Court has reined in liability expanding decisions by the Montana Supreme Court, notably in BNSF v. Terrell, where the U.S. Supreme Court reversed Montana's Supreme Courts and found that a state may only exercise personal jurisdiction where that company is at home. This decision was crucial in closing the door to abusive forum shopping in Montana by out-of-state plaintiffs' attorneys. Third, tougher standards for expert evidence. In Horn v. St. Peter Hospital, the state Supreme Court emphasized that the standard of care in medical negligence claims has to be established through expert testimony. Second, in Melton v. Spieth, the state Supreme Court affirmed a trial court dismissal of medical malpractice claim because of a plaintiff's expert witness lacked sufficient qualifications. And lastly, in Griffin v. Lewis, the state Supreme Court again affirmed a trial court dismissal of a plaintiff's claim for similar reasons. Plaintiff's expert lacked qualifications. Fourth, recent Montana Supreme Court decisions improved the state's insurance environment. Law 360 included a pair of Montana Supreme Court rulings that limited policyholders' ability to enter into stipulated judgments, among the biggest insurance decisions of 2019. The Montana Supreme Court found in those decisions that a $12 million consent judgment between a policyholder and a claimant was collusive and dismissed the lawsuit. And in the other case, that a policyholder cannot obligate its insurer to pay a settlement it was not invited to weigh in on, unless that insurer failed to defend its policyholder. And lastly, Montana has adopted meaningful civil justice reforms. In 2017, Montana lowered the statutory interest rate on court judgments to protect civil defendants from having to pay a rate of interest that substantially exceeded the prevailing market interest rates. The state lowered its interest rate from a fixed rate of 10% per year to a variable rate that tracks the prime rate published by the Federal Reserve System. I hope you all have majors in economics. Despite the very positive ranking in our most recent survey, Montana policymakers can't become complacent. We have seen other high-ranking states fall in subsequent rankings. As an example, Minnesota, which was 4th in 2017, fell to 20th in 2019, which was their lowest ranking in 2 decades. New Hampshire, which was 5th in 2017, dropped to 18th in 2019. And there's certainly a cautionary tale to be told about Delaware, which was 1st in every single one of our surveys between 2002 and 2015, before they dropped to 11th in 2017 before rebounding in the 2019 survey. As Harold Kim, ILR's president, who has spoken here in Montana several times, would say, don't skate to where the puck is, skate to where it is going. Montana's legal climate right now is as good as it has ever been, but that doesn't mean it is always going to stay that way. This effort to ensure that Montana continues to have a positive legal climate is key because we know that a predictable legal environment directly impacts business investment decisions. The costs of lawsuits on businesses are astronomical. In ILR's most recent tort liability costs for small businesses study, we found that total costs and compensation in the tort system relating to commercial liabilities has grown to $343 billion a year. Of that, $182 billion a year is borne by small businesses. In this instance, businesses with under $10 million in annual revenue. That money is tied up in litigation and therefore can't be used to expand, innovate, hire, all things I know Montana businesses are interested in. And that is why we at the U.S. Chamber are so passionate about legal reform. We believe for a state to be truly pro-business, they must also create a positive legal reform climate. In Montana's efforts to recruit and retain businesses, a welcoming legal environment should be a big part of that effort. Which leads me to the final topic of my prepared remarks. Emerging litigation trends that Montana businesses should keep their eyes on. There are two in particular I want to highlight. The first is litigation funding. Third-party litigation funding, which is where hedge funds and other financiers investing in lawsuits to which they are not a party in return for a cut of the winnings, has become a massive problem. Firms like Burford Capital, Omni Bridgeway, and Parabellum Capital rely on crises and abusive litigation to turn a profit. In fact, Omni Bridgeway's Allison Chuck said that, and I quote, "We are drinking from a fire hose in terms of COVID-19 litigation, as law firms look to reduce risk." Current size of the U.S. litigation finance market in terms of implied commitment capacity of the U.S. funders is now factored at $10 billion according to the Litigation Finance Journal. Now, take that number with a grain of salt, as there are other sources and other numbers out there, but in all cases, it is a remarkably high number. In terms of the ILR and what are we doing about that? Well, we have deployed an integrated research and communications and advocacy strategy for transparency. We're advocating for state and federal rule changes to require disclosure of TPLF agreements. Second, municipal litigation and public nuisance law. When it comes to municipality litigation and public nuisance laws, plaintiffs' lawyers have developed a new and deeply troubling business model of pitching their services to cities, counties, school districts, Native American tribes, and political activists to sue businesses on a contingency fee basis. We've seen claims filed over data privacy, lead paint, climate change, mortgage lending, chemicals like PFAS, and much more. One of the key facilitators of these suits is the public nuisance theory of litigation. This is a relic of 12th century English law, when the plaintiff's bar has resurrected to allege widespread public harms while sidestepping causation. At the ILR, we've published research and commentary pointing out the shaky legal underpinnings of public nuisance and the fact that municipality litigation undermines the ability of authority of the state attorney generals to act on issues of statewide concern. I can touch on some other emerging trends during the question and answer session. But with that, I'll conclude by saying that even though the legislature is out of session this year, that doesn't mean there isn't work to be done. Legal reform is an ongoing commitment that has to be renewed year after year, because the trial bar is always innovating. So I would urge you to use this time to lay the groundwork for next session, as I know the Montana Chamber is doing. This is an opportunity to engage with policymakers, get out ahead of litigation drivers I talked about, and take on some of the issues that other states are grappling with, like data privacy and trial lawyer advertising. And as you put in that work, know that the U.S. Chamber is always going to be there to help you in your effort to make Montana the most business-friendly state in the Union. Thank you very much.
David, thank you. That was great. I have a lineup of questions based on those insights, but in the event Senator Fitzpatrick bookends any of those thoughts beforehand, I'll transition to him, and then we'll get into Q&A. Again, be thinking of your questions for these two panelists, please.
Well,
Senator.
Good, thank you. Thank you for being here. My name is Steve Fitzpatrick. Like David said, I'm a legislator. I'm a senator from Great Falls. I represent most of the rural parts of Cascade County and parts of the city of Great Falls. I've also been practicing law for, I think, about 18 years now. And I actually do have to agree with your kids. It's not cool to have a visit from a guy selling malpractice insurance. So, what I'd like to do today is kind of give kind of an overview of some of the bills we considered in the legislature, but maybe give you a little bit of perspective. When I first started practicing law, I practiced at a law firm that practiced almost exclusively insurance defense. And what that is in English is that when you buy insurance, an insurance company owes you a couple duties, and one of those is to hire you a lawsuit, or hire you an attorney when you get involved in a lawsuit. And the insurance company has law firms on what they call on a panel, and when those lawsuits come in, they would hire our law firm, among other law firms in the state, to defend the insureds. So over that time, I've certainly had a chance to see a lot of the different ways in which our legal system is used, sometimes to the benefit, but sometimes to the detriment of people as well. Over time, my practice, I first started doing a lot of defense of things like car wrecks, slip and falls, accidents on job sites. Over time, that started to change to more construction law issues. I did a lot of work involving defective construction in Great Falls, where houses would move or settle. And then over time, as I continue to practice today, I've actually taken on more of a plaintiff's bent. So about half of my work now, I represent people that are filing lawsuits, but I still do quite a bit of insurance defense work as well. So I think that kind of has informed me as a legislator. There are some things that I don't like in the legal system, but there are other things I think that are actually good and are beneficial. But I think if you look back over time, and these are the old war stories you would hear around the law firm, there's always been this kind of push and pull between the legislative branch and the judicial branch. The judicial branch will, craft rules and render decisions. Then the legislative branch comes in and fixes those. And I think, the first tort reform in the state of Montana really started in the 1980s. Back in those days, we had things like negligent discharge. And we did away with that with the Wrongful Discharge Act that was passed in the 80s. There was a lot of liability against banks in those days. And then that evolved into the 90s. There were some minor tort reform packages, but there really was a block for the last 16 years. We in the legislature would bring bills, and they would meet the veto pen continuously from both Governor Schweitzer and Governor Bullock. So there really was a backlog here of things I think that needed to be corrected. And that's what we did in the last session. This was probably one of the most substantive legislative sessions I think we've had in a generation. You didn't see it in the newspaper. The newspapers wanted to focus on the social issues and all the stuff that gets the newspaper headlines and gets the clicks when they're on the internet. But we passed a lot of bills. We passed a lot of substantive bills. And I think we'll go through a couple of them. I don't want to turn this into a continuing legal education class, but what I do is I want to hit some of the highlights so you kind of can see what we did, because I think you'll be actually fairly amazed at some of the changes we made. So the first one I'd like to start with is the COVID liability. This was something that was fairly prominent at the beginning of the session. And for good reason, because I think this was one of the main concerns I think that people had about restarting their businesses, reopening their businesses, was the potential for COVID liability. So what we did was we went and modeled some legislation off of things that had been passed in other states. Primarily Iowa was our model. And what we did was we increased the threshold for liability. So ordinarily you owe what's in the legal terms a duty of care of a negligence standard. We raised that up to gross negligence. So in order for there to be liability, you basically have to be indifferent to anything. If you're making a good faith effort now to comply with government regulations, you're basically going to be immune under our statutory system now. There are also special requirements or special statutory sections for people to give products away. There's a special provision for products liability. Nurses and physicians and doctors there's another section that involves them where they can get some liability protection if they have to make decisions related to COVID related issues, just such as just rescheduling surgeries and so forth. I mean, COVID liability just isn't contracting COVID. It's the ripple effect that causes it to move through your system, shutdowns of businesses, delays in hospital surgeries, those kind of things. And this is what Senate Bill 65 does. It really offers that protection to business people and really to everybody for COVID liability. We also extended that out to government agencies. So House Bill 435, it's a separate bill, mainly because there's a different standard for government liability in the state of Montana than there is for private liability. So government is going to get the same protection. We also worked in, I think, some special sections that are kind of unique to Montana. I know people were concerned about, do we have to wear a mask? Do I have to force people to wear masks? Do I have to require people to get vaccines? We went into this bill and we put in specific requirements that said, you don't breach the standard of care if you don't require a mask. You don't have to mandate temperature checks. You don't have to mandate vaccines. And we really did that, I think, as a way to obviously encourage people to open their business, but to avoid some of those confrontations that people were getting when they opened their business and required things like masks at the door. So I think that was a kind of a common sense solution. I think this is probably one of the better bills in the whole country, to be honest. Is we did the research. Most states were kind of thin. We actually went in and put down some definite rules. So I think it's a good start on the COVID liability. Now the next one, and I know this was a key one for the chamber, was the Wrongful Discharge Act. This bill, or the Wrongful Discharge Act, like I said, it's been around for about 40 years. But there were some issues with it, and we went in with this bill and made some modifications I think that will be beneficial and I think kind of level the playing field, so to speak. Montana is one of the only states in the country what's called cause termination. Every state in the country except for Montana, and I think a couple other ones, is at will. So what that means is that if you've got an employee and he's been working on your job now for 18 months, you have to have a reason to fire him. In every other state in the country, you can terminate a bad employee basically at any time. So what we did was we extended out the probationary period. During that probationary period, it's 12 months. That's kind of an at-will time. We've moved that up to 18 months. We also added in some definitions for good cause so that you can have some additional reasons to let go of those employees that aren't doing a good job. We added in a couple provisions here, I think, related to the time for notification. You can see that down below. There's 14 days to notify the discharged employee about the existence of internal procedures. My recollection is that was 7 days. And then there's also some other procedures in there. So we also changed the way the award is calculated, so you calculate in other monetary factors. The damages under the Wrongful Discharge Act are about 4 years of compensation. So by adding in other forms of compensation, I think you get a little bit fairer result. And I think the last one is that if you're going to sue under the Wrongful Discharge Act, you got to get your complaint in. Normally under the law, you get 3 years to do it. This moves it up to 6 months. So if you're going to fire somebody, you're going to know right away whether you're going to get sued. The next one, and this is a huge one. This is something you never hear about, but it's probably one of the biggest pieces of tort reform you could ask to pass in any state. And this is one where we're changing the amount of recoverable medical expenses. You're probably thinking, what the heck is this? The way it works under our law is, let's say you injure somebody. That person goes to the hospital and comes out with a $30,000 medical bill. Under our law, you go back. So they get that $30,000 medical bill. They send it to their health insurer. They send it to Medicare. Medicare pays $10,000, and then there's no liability exposure to the person who was injured for the $20,000. So the actual charged amount, the actual paid amount is $10,000. Under our law, you could walk into the jury room or into the courtroom and put up that $30,000 figure and claim to the jury that that's the damages, that you incurred $30,000 in medical damages even though you only paid $10,000. Essentially, it's a fake number. It's a non-existent damage. That's why it's called a phantom damage. That's the phrase here. So what this bill does is it gets rid of that that fake number, and it allows the jury to consider what you actually incurred as damages. This is a big deal. Because it affects the valuation of claims. When I, as a lawyer, get a claim that comes into my office, the first thing I do is I say, what are the medical bills, or what are the special damages? And those are things like lost wages and medical bills. I add those up, and then there's just kind of a rule of thumb in the state of Montana. It's not everywhere. Venue determines a lot of it, but when you have, you usually multiply that special damage number by 2 to 3, and that's the value of the case. That's what a mediator is going to look at settling it for. That's what you're going to tell your client you think the case is worth. That's what, and that's what most people expect. So if you're valuing cases starting with a start number, for example, of $30,000, you're going to say that thing is worth $60,000 to $90,000. If you value it at a start number of 10, you're saying 20 to 30. Now, that's just one example, but you get damages up into millions of dollars like you can. All of a sudden, those insurance policies that you've got, they're not going to cover everything. You can have damages, multi-million-dollar cases. So this is really, I think, a key part in making sure that people are treated fairly, but also making sure that your insurance prices are actually reasonable for what you're getting for coverage. Now, another one is this is another one from the Common Sense Department. Many years ago, the old law was, so this is 50, 60 years ago, your liability for a person on your property. So these are slip and falls, premise liability claims. You used to have different duties of care to what was called a licensee, invitee, and a trespasser. The invitee would be the person who came into your store. The licensee was the person that came over for your Christmas party. And then the trespasser was owed no duty, except in very limited circumstances. In 1997, the Montana Supreme Court did away with that, and we went to a duty of care to everybody. So you owed a duty of care under what's called the Richardson case to anybody who was on your property, anybody. So to the most extreme example, I gave this one on the radio this morning, was the burglar comes into your house. He's in the process of robbing you, and he slips and trips over the Christmas presents that you left outside. He could sue you because you didn't provide him a safe place to commit his crime. You were supposed to anticipate this injury, and that's the law. That is the law. You have to anticipate the injury. So what this bill does very simply is it says, no, we don't give trespassers a duty of care here. So I think, like I said, this was out of the Common Sense Department. I think one that we needed to do a long time ago. And I'll just go through these quickly here. This was actually a bill I brought. This was one that used to drive me crazy as a defense lawyer doing construction work. We would get sued under multiple statutes. There's actually specifically a statute for construction defects, and it's actually a good one for plaintiffs, to be honest, because you get to recover your attorney's fees, which you normally don't do. There's also another statute called the Consumer Protection Act. That one allows attorney's fees and then what are called treble damages. So the example would be if you had $1,000 of damages, you could have the court treble it to $3,000. Okay, that's fine. Let's start talking about a house worth $100,000. All of a sudden, you're looking at a damage of $300,000. So what we did was for construction defect claims, you're not under the Consumer Protection Act. So ironically, this may sound crazy. This is the one I probably have gotten calls now from about 4 different lawyers who want to know about this one because they've been defending cases against contractors and they want to get rid of these Consumer Protection Act claims. We also went and this was a bill by Representative Regier, another good one. That Consumer Protection Act, I've always thought it was very unfair because you're allowing tripling of damages in cases where you've already facing immense amount of liability exposure anyways. You could have $1 million claim and all of a sudden somebody's saying, well, you violated the Consumer Protection Act, pay me $3 million. So what we did was we put a cap on when you can go in and ask for those damages. In this bill, that would be House Bill 472. This one I won't go into real detail here, but one of the areas, especially for bigger businesses, is liability for hazardous substances in the ground. The law has, I think, gotten fairly, I wouldn't say out of whack, but But they're very difficult cases, and I think there's a lot of concern that people are not necessarily even cleaning up the property after they get these awards. So what we've done here is we've put in some language about the appropriate use of remediation damages. Those are damages to fix the land as opposed to just getting damage for loss of value. And then finally, I do want to mention this because this is, from my perspective as a lawyer, this is the hot area of legal work for me. This is House Bill 702. This is not a tort reform bill, by the way. This is a bill that prohibits you from discriminating against employees based on vaccine status. You can't do it unless, of course, you're trumped by federal rule. But I think everybody in this room should know about House Bill 702. You can't be penalizing your employees because they refuse to take a vaccine. You can't take adverse discrimination or actions against them unless, of course, there is a federal rule that governs you. So if you run in a small business and you're not affected by the federal rules, 702 is your guidestone. You should know about it if you're going to do anything related to vaccines. So I think that's kind of my summary. I don't know how long I went, but glad to go over any of the bills we passed in the legislature.
Excellent. And I think Bridger and Michelle will be circulating around with the microphone if you have questions. Let me just, since Steve spoke last and brought up, I think, an important topic, the 10th came and went, and the Supreme Court has not yet weighed in, and there's this question of what preempts the House Bill 702. A lot of employers in this room, I suspect, who are trying to figure out what to do and which of those two they can take shelter of under most safely. I'd ask either panelist if you have an opinion on that.
Well, the advice I give is you have to follow the federal regulations, and there's 3 federal regulations. There's the specific Medicare ones, which apply to healthcare providers. There's the federal contractor rule, which applies to people that have contracts with the federal government, and then there's the OSHA 100-person rule. These rules are incredibly complex. They're hard to work through. There are little exceptions if you really want to start weaving your way through them, but I think if you are governed by one of those, you need to follow those rules. This isn't to say you're not going to get sued for taking an adverse employment action. It unfortunately is kind of the quandary we're in, but I think you have to follow the federal rules to the extent they're applicable. If the rules are not applicable, you need to make sure you're following 702, though, because you will get hit with a human rights complaint.
Look, I would echo most of that and just say that's where we think we come in as the U.S. Chamber, as being both an advocate voice, but also being a source of information. I encourage any business to go on our website, which we help spell out as we see it, the OSHA aspect of this. I will say in terms of 702, and it's interesting being on a panel about predictability, right? That's what we want to see as the chamber. We want to be help businesses have as predictable of a legal and otherwise climate as they can. And certainly from our perspective, in terms of 702, the can't is just as dangerous as the must. And we want to allow, whether it's from the federal standpoint or from 702, businesses to make those decisions for themselves.
Excellent, thank you. Questions from the audience? Let me just ask too, while you're making your way to the person there, David, you mentioned really the stunning and impressive ascent of Montana's ranking on the ILR list. And as I was hearing that and kind of drawing on our own kind of observations and experiences at our highest court in the state, I kind of cynically wondered whether the tide of the lower courts had come in and really lifted the Supreme Court. But then you cited a number of cases and kind of preempted that perspective. And so I guess I'd ask if you have, or if that survey reveals any distinction about our judicial environment as a whole versus the Supreme Court specifically. And then I guess the follow-up would be, there seems to be some dangers of a sugar high on some of these where you can kind of gum up and crash pretty quick. I mean, where do you see Montana in that, coming up to 7th?
So look, I would say, one, in terms of the survey, it doesn't typically get that granular, and it's much more about what the perception is of the legal climate in this and every other state. And of course, perception is reality, and so oftentimes chicken or the egg? How much is it the court cases, and certainly that those are out there, versus some of the laws? I mean, as the most recent example, the COVID liability, which, as the senator says, is one of the best in the country, and I think that helps feed that. In terms of the sugar high, look, I think that's where, as I highlighted, you have to keep your foot on the gas. And I know in talking to Bridger and the Montana Chamber, you guys are working on some great ideas for the next legislative session, and that's key. It's important to get out in front. As I said, the plaintiff's bar is constantly innovating. I mean, these things I talked about of applying this archaic 12th century public nuisance law to areas that it shouldn't apply to are just one of the many, many ways that they're constantly innovating. And so we, as the business community, have to continue to stay out in front of those issues.
All right, thank you. Did I see you? Were you navigating towards a question? Yes, in the back.
Senator, a lot of great work in 2021. I'm sure based on what you've done, there's got to be a lot of people asking you about 2023 and other reforms. I was curious, do you have a docket piling up of additional reforms that will be seen in 2023?
I was actually just asked that question outside by Bill Warden. He told me the answer was I passed all the bills there were to pass. But I do think that there are some areas where I think there could be some additional work. We did have a bill that was, for example, vetoed by the governor. It wasn't vetoed because of the tort reform content in it, but for other reasons. I think that would be a good starting point. That had a provision in there for dealing with what's called the consumption offset, kind of a technical thing in wrongful discharge cases. We may want to go back to that. I think there's a lot to do. There's a lot of issues to talk about. Maybe when we want to talk about statute of limitations, maybe when we want to talk about service of process times. So I think there's a lot to do. My perspective always has been, I don't want the court system or our legal system to be slanted unfairly in either direction. I want it to be fair. It shouldn't be overweighted toward business, but it shouldn't be overweighted to the plaintiff's bar either. It needs to be fair for everybody. So there are things that I probably would come along I may not support. I do plaintiff's work from time to time, and I think it's important that we do have predictability, and we don't need to change some of the decisions that are unique to Montana that have been around for a while. So,
thank you. Another question.
I think I've also got one for the senator, and this is because you had drafted up a piece of legislation related to this, but didn't ultimately introduce it. And we've had some interface about it since then. But on product liability in Montana, if you could touch on your take on where that is now. It's my understanding that it's, especially for those like manufacturers in this room that are creating a tangible good or service, especially the physical goods. When it comes to the liability of defects in that product, it seems like, from what I understand, that Montana's law is a little bit, you're either totally liable or not at all, and whereas there might be some preference to get a little bit more, like some options out there as far as how it could be partial liability versus all or nothing. If you could touch on that, Senator.
No, that's a good question. So if you were going to bring a products liability case, and I've defended a number of them over the years, there's a couple theories you can sue on. What would be called the negligence theory, and then we also have a statutory theory. And I think that's probably an area where a lot of work could be done. I know in the state of Wisconsin, they brought in a fairly substantial package of things that addressed strict liability issues. And strict liability means you're absolutely liable. If there's a problem, you're done. You're just liable. There's no getting away around it. Under our products liability scheme in the state of Montana, there's really only two defenses. One is that you misused the product, or that you caused a defect in the product that contributed to the accident. I think there are some things that we could talk about, whether a time limit for these. I had the guy I work with. He had a claim for products liability. It was a trailer that was, had been manufactured and sold something like 25, 30 years ago, and here's the manufacturer getting sued for products liability. We may want to have some kind of statute of repose, which would just be an ultimate bar on claims. Another defense is that, this is always my favorite, is that you have a product that's been out in circulation for a while, and then you're told that you could have designed it better. Well, you designed it the best you could at the time using the best available technology, and then you hear that, well, you should have done this. Well, nobody was doing it until 4 years later. But it's just the joy of products liability defense. I think there's a lot that could be done in there. That would certainly be an area I think we should look at.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Dave, you mentioned briefly something about privacy, and that raised a couple red flags. Does the U.S. Chamber have a policy on where we should be heading with privacy legislation?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and one that is definitely taking over the conversation in state houses across the country. From that perspective, the U.S. Chamber believes there should be a federal policy, having all of these various states kind of competing, but unfortunately in many cases in the wrong direction is not a great thing. California started the conversation, and it's, from our perspective, not a great law, the CCPA. Virginia has one now, Colorado has one now. In that sense, it's moving in a better direction. Ohio is debating a data privacy bill as we speak that we by and large like. But no, we absolutely think that there should be one comprehensive federal standard. In light of that, we are working with states across the country to craft what we think is an ideal data privacy law to give both consumers and businesses a sense of what to do. From our perspective, there's 5, 6, 7 things that should be a part of all these data privacy laws. One of the biggest aspects is not having what we would call PRA, private right of action. We think that these are very complex cases that should rest with, at the state level, state AGs. We think that businesses should have a chance to cure a cure period as part of any data privacy law. There should be very clear notice of any violation. There should be a cap on damages as a part of any data privacy law, limit attorney's fees, and as I said, make sure that the enforcement sits with the state AG. So we absolutely do believe in data privacy, but it's how you craft it that's important.
Thank you. Let me ask both of you your thoughts on a question. You might have somewhat opposing thoughts on it. I remember in the last session testifying before a committee, and the individual who went before me was testifying in support of something that I was opposing, and he was leaning heavily on our kind of Montana independence and arguing for putting us on a judicial island by ourselves. And I just was, just wanted to crawl out of my skin at that moment, where we have a state that's 146,000 square miles and 1 million people. It's already more expensive for most companies to provide not just durable goods, but even services, just because of the beauty and the vastness and the sparse population of our geography. California can pull that kind of stuff because they have the economy of a medium-sized country. We don't. And so, as I kind of look at it, I think, look, there are characteristics of Montana, our industry, our geography, that very well may lend themselves to something unique about how we approach things judicially. But outside of that, romanticizing these characteristics that put us alone compared to the rest of the country, at least in my industry, I can tell you firsthand from my industry that there are insurance products across the personal lines realm that are not offered here or not offered at the same rates here, because that kind of philosophy has been employed in so many aspects of our law. And I'm interested because I know most of those judicial islands are very well intended and genuinely directed at trying to protect somebody. And so there's tension. It's just genuine tension. I'd be interested in each of your thoughts on this kind of judicial uniqueness that Montana has in so many places.
That's a good question. I mean, it's a frequent argument you hear at the legislature. Everybody's doing it, or we should be different. My view on all bills when they come before me is this just good public policy? I don't really care if it's unique to Montana or if it's what everybody else is doing. There are some areas of our tort system that I think are unique to Montana, and I think are actually not bad policy. I'll give you an example. We have in the state of Montana, we have a Supreme Court decision. We have a couple of them that require what are called advance payments of medical bills, lost wages. So if you get hurt in an accident and you get drug out for whatever reason, long treatment, the insurance company, if liability is reasonably clear, has to pay your lost wages. They have to pay your medical bills. I think that's a fine rule, especially if liability is reasonably clear. This insurance company is probably going to pay the damages anyways. So what does it matter if it gets paid early or not? I think the problem comes, and I think most insurance companies are good at that. You'll get somebody every once in a while that doesn't know the rules, and they make a mistake, and then they get sued for bad faith. But part of my law practice is, a lot of it is just trying to help people do the right thing to get in compliance with the law. I certainly don't want to ever have my client get sued for bad faith or some violation of a statute. So, we try and work with them and give them the best advice we can to resolve the case as expeditiously and fast as we can. But I think the overall question is, I think it's the same. I don't want to give a campaign speech here, but my overall theme, this is what I tell everybody when I run for the legislature, is that I'm going to do what's best for the people of Montana. I'm going to do what I think is best public policy. And if people in California are doing something different, then so be it. It needs to be what's best for us.
Yeah, not to give a political answer, but I would go somewhere in the middle on that, in the sense that at the U.S. Chamber, one of the things we have within ILR is the Legal Reform Network, where we have partners in all 50 states, and we lean on them. We talk to them. We understand what their challenges are and what they're facing in their states, and not try to come from the D.C. perspective always and tell them what they should do. I think every state is unique, and that's a good thing. At the same time, it's not an island, right? It's a part of the contiguous United States, and it's very important. I mean, again, on a panel about predictability for business, I'm sure many of you operate in various other states, and I'm sure there's many businesses from other states that operate here, and giving business that predictability to know that, hey, you need to check the law, and it might be a little bit different in Montana or California or vice versa, but having some predictability there in terms of what they're going to see everywhere is important.
Thank you. Anything from the audience? Don't be intimidated by these guys. They're not as mean as they look. Let me ask you, David, while Bridger's thinking of something creative to say, the third-party litigation funding, you brought that up.
Yeah.
Maybe do you see any Montana-specific evidence? I mean, that is a dynamic that I know has become a major problem in certain parts of the country, and it seems like reform efforts are kind of sweeping the nation and taking root in some ways much faster than reform efforts of other kinds have been. So give us, you got any Montana-specific color for that?
So honestly, no, I don't want to get out in front of my skis in terms of what's happening here in Montana, but I can say there's not a part of the country I'm aware of where it's not a factor, where you don't have these major hedge funds coming in and finding litigation. That's the problem. At the end of the day, we're not saying that lawsuit lending, as an example, shouldn't exist. We understand there's going to be times where the little guy, quote unquote, has been wronged and justifiably needs recourse and doesn't have the means to do that. But that's a very different thing than these major hedge funds essentially finding litigation and not helping the consumer, where the vast majority of that money goes back in their pockets. But as you rightly say, the reform is coming quickly as well, and we need it. But I think to the senator's point about common sense, to me, and I think to most of the business community, it fits into the common sense bucket. We're talking about transparency here. We're not talking about shutting it down, but there are many, many times in third-party litigation funding cases where the judge, him or herself, doesn't even know there's outside money coming in. So that's a part of the process in terms of enhancing transparency and making sure that everybody knows what's happening, especially when it comes to settlements, right? If you don't, as the opposing counsel, don't know that this money is coming from an outside source, that's going to greatly impact whether or not you'll settle, and eventually, whether or not the consumer is harmed even further.
Thank you. Yeah, I was involved in a conversation recently where there was an observation that not only was the judge unaware, but the judge may have had an investment in the very hedge fund that was backing it, which
Incredible.
Makes the lack of awareness all the more problematic.
Can't make it up.
Questions from the audience. This has really been an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. David, I want to just thank you for traveling to Montana. We have another one. Please, question.
Yes, for Senator Fitzpatrick. Senator, some legislators are bigger workhorses than other legislators. Do you remember how many bills you carried this year, Senator Fitzpatrick?
I don't know the total number I carried. I think it was in the 60s. I think when it was all said and done, it was around 50 that I passed. Of course, that includes a couple where we were firing people, so I'm not sure if I should count those, but I did get to 50.
Now, I'm not sure, but do you happen to know, is that more bills that anyone has passed in one legislative session?
I don't know the answer to that.
I think it probably is, and I think it's more probably than some states maybe even pass the entire session. So. But anyway, I wanted to congratulate Senator Fitzpatrick on his recognition here and also on the great job he does in the legislature. Thank you.
That's such a great observation, and just take that observation as an opportunity to say to any of you who have in the past or are currently serving in our state legislature, that is such an enormous sacrifice on behalf of the people of Montana, and we just really appreciate it. And then you go to that kind of next level, as you so rightly pointed out, because Senator Fitzpatrick not only carried and led so many bills, but I can say from experience of having been supportive of some and in opposition of others, he not just invites the discussion, but he feeds off of, I think, the intellectual debate, and that's an enormous lift. But it's also the way politics is supposed to work, because just because you can ram something through doesn't mean you should ram something through. And I've seen Senator Fitzpatrick really look for the opportunity to have the intellectual discussion and then bob and weave based on how impressive or impressionable he thought that those comments were. So thank you for making that observation. Well, with that, I think we have a few more minutes, but I think we might give it to you as a gift here this afternoon. And again, David, thank you for traveling to our beautiful state and sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate the work that the U.S. Chamber does and the Institute for Legal Reform. It gives us a great report card measuring each state against the other, and it also helps keep the union together to have the type of judicial consistency that can provide predictability, certainty in certain circumstances, and protect the vulnerable businesses and people alike. Senator Fitzpatrick, thank you for your time today, for your leadership in the last session, for your assured leadership in the upcoming session. We really appreciate the work that you do. And again, as the MVP for the Montana Chamber in 21, for the many impactful bills that you led and passed, we really do appreciate it. All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
I feel like we should have a little subline that says you do not have to have a law degree to run for the legislature, but I guess it sure does help. So thank you again, David, for leading the panel, and Senator Fitzpatrick and David for your continued efforts on tort reform. We'll look forward to following that story. So it's been a great afternoon. Thank you so much for your intention and engagement here. Got a couple announcements before we close. Our program tomorrow starts at 7:30 here. The Lawmaker Appreciation Reception and Banquet starts at 6 p.m. over at the Civic Center. There's no program there tonight. It's just about spending time together and engaging in conversation. So please join us for that relaxing evening and wonderful meal. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors one more time. At the platinum level, we have Boeing, Northwestern Energy, Montana State Fund, First Interstate Bank, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Broadreach Power, Stockman Bank, Valley Bank, and Alaska Airlines. Our gold level sponsors, Charter Communications, Pacific Source Health Plans, Washington Companies, BNSF, Applied Materials, Atlantic Richfield Company, Montana Bakers Association, and Allegiance. And then silver level sponsors, Republic Services, Bristol Myers Squibb, Montana Youth Apprenticeship Program, Microsoft, Frontier Institute, Crowley Fleck, and Anderson Zermulin. Bronze level sponsors: Payne West Insurance, Montana Hydraulics, UBS, Mountain Health Co-op, University of Washington, WWAMI program, and Taylor Luther Group, Soken Engineering, Century Gaming, Billings Clinic, and MDU Resources. And Copper sponsors Leadership Montana and Montana's credit unions. And tonight, our banquet and reception is sponsored by Blackfoot Communications, Enbridge Energy, Montana Secretary of State, Montana State University, University of Montana, and the Office of the Commissioner of Higher Education. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.